All right, so we're back. We have moved corners or moved locations. We're now back at State and First next to Michael Sago Jr.'s memorial pole, memorial location. And there's more of these like this out here. We got 14 in total, and they're in a 1-by-1 block radius, the Say Their Name Square. So if you guys come out here, you can see more poles adorned like this, more memorials. I don't think you can quite see it on camera, but here at the base of the pole, we got some things that we put out here, some things the family brought out here, and then some other memorials have similar things, and their family has come out too. They got some stuff from the family. So if you're family, if you're part of the community, if you're still in mourning, which it never gets easy after losing a loved one, especially to violence of any kind, but really violence from the people who are supposed to be here to protect you. I can't imagine what that loss feels like. So we got some memorials set up here for families and members of the community to come out and just see the faces and see the names of these victims of police brutality and police terrorism. And it's up here in this 1-by-1 block radius, going down to Walnut and First, and then over to Second and Walnut, and then back up to State and Second. The book that we are reading, though, we had left off, just finished chapter 5, going into chapter 6 of the Rise of the Warrior Cop. And so I'm going to start back on chapter 6, called The 1980s, Us and Them. And there's a quote, says, "It now appears that victory over the Fourth Amendment is complete." And that's from William Brennan. William French Smith set the tone for the Reagan administration early on. In one of the first cabinet meetings, the new Attorney General declared, "The Justice Department is not a domestic agency. It is the internal arm of the national defense." This would be a rough decade for the symbolic Third Amendment. Reagan's drug warriors were about to take aim at posse comitatus, utterly dehumanized drug users, cast the drug fight as a biblical struggle between good and evil, and in the process, turn the country's drug cops into holy soldiers. Smith surrounded himself with a crew of prosecutors who called themselves the hard chargers. Sorry if you can hear that. Smith surrounded himself with a crew of prosecutors who called themselves the hard chargers. One was Rudy Giuliani, a rising star brought to Washington by Smith after he had racked up some impressive federal drug prosecutions in New York. In an interview with the journalist Dan Baum, Lowell Jensen, another of Smith's advisors, said that the first task Smith assigned Giuliani was to survey U.S. attorneys, cops, and prosecutors across the country about how the federal government could get more involved in fighting local crime. The overwhelming answer Smith got back was the same answer John Smith got when he posed the same question to his aides in the early days of the Nixon administration's launch war on drugs. So they did. with some sweeping new policies. One of the most significant new policies came thanks to a fortuitous bit of timing. Shortly after Reagan took office, the General Accounting Office, or GAO, released a report commissioned by Democratic Senator Joe Biden of Delaware a year earlier on the use of civil asset forfeiture. Civil forfeiture was a concept that had a long tradition in English common law. Under the law of deodans, Latin for given to God, any time a piece of property caused a death, the property itself could be deemed guilty of the crime, at which point its value had to be forfeited over to the crown. In colonial times, the concept was extended to allow the state to seize and confiscate ships that had been used to smuggle contraband. The Crown's abuse of the practice is often credited with inspiring the Fifth Amendment's prohibition on the taking of property without due process. But until the 1970s, the government couldn't take property that wasn't directly used in a crime. The government could shut down an illegal brothel, but it couldn't touch a house or car or boat the owner had bought with revenue generated by the brothel. That all changed when a young policy wonk named Robert Blakey, formerly of Robert F. Kennedy's Justice Department, conceived a way to extend the government's reach. Under Blakey's idea, once the government convicted someone on charges related to organized crime, prosecutors could go after everything the guilty party had bought and earned with the proceeds of the criminal enterprise. Blakey called the law RICO, Racketeering, Influenced, and Corrupt Organizations, after Rico Bandello, the fictional gangster in the 1931 movie Little Caesar. Originally conceived to target organized crime, by the time the law passed in 1970, it had become so broad that even Nixon's hardliners were concerned. In opposing the law, Nixon's Justice Department told Congress that its broad reach would result in a large number of unintended consequences. Reagan's Justice Department had no such reservations. The 1981 GAO report concluded that the government wasn't using forfeiture nearly enough and that an excellent opportunity to collect revenue was going to waste. Reagan's people would take care of that. Reagan had also brought in the FBI to help enforce the drug laws. The agency had long resisted joining the drug war, particularly under J. Edgar Hoover. The legendary PR-savvy director knew the issue was a loser and tended to lure law enforcement into corruption. But by 1980, Hoover had been gone for 7 years. It was time to bring the FBI into the fold. The new administration also wanted to do away with the exclusionary rule, override Miranda, abolish bail and parole, douse pot farms with herbicides, put far more focus on enforcement and far less on treatment, and perhaps most radically of all, enlist the military in the war on drugs. The administration would focus most of these efforts on marijuana, on the theory that 1, marijuana is a gateway to harder drugs, and 2, people using cocaine and heroin are already too far gone to bother saving. There was also a strategic advantage to going after pot. Successfully targeting and demonizing the least harmful illegal drug would push any talk of decriminalizing the others outside the realm of acceptable debate. But if this was going to be a real war, Reagan would need to secure his role as commander-in-chief. He couldn't have Congress or rogue bureaucrats going off message or questioning or holding up his initiatives. Here again, he took a play from Nixon's playbook. Reagan created a new office, a more Caesar-ish sort of drug Caesar. The position would report directly to him and would coordinate and oversee all anti-drug efforts throughout the executive branch. At the suggestion of billionaire data processing mogul and future presidential candidate H. Ross Perot, Reagan chose Carlton Turner to be his new, even Caesarier drug czar. Turner was a native Alabaman who, oddly enough, had spent years running the country's only legal marijuana plot at the University of Mississippi. That experience with pot gave Turner a convincing air of authority that would become particularly important when he started making patently absurd statements about the drug. Turner had no specialized knowledge of other illicit drugs, but that didn't matter at the time. Pot was really all that was important. By the time Reagan publicly announced the appointment in June 1982, Turner was already a favorite among the increasingly dogmatic anti-pot parent organizations proliferating in the suburbs. His appointment was also an early indication that the federal government's new drug war would no longer pay much attention to treating addicts. In previous administrations, the drug czar had been a treatment-oriented position. Under Turner, it became an enforcement office. Underlying all of his focus on pot was a surge of cultural conservatism into positions of power in the new administration. The late 1960s and early 1970s had seen the emergence of a movement of conservative intellectuals. Periodicals like Commentary, The Public Interest, and occasionally National Review were featuring think pieces from people like Robert Bork, Ernest van den Haag, James Q. Wilson, and James Burnham. Where someone like George Wallace openly appealed to base prejudices, and the moral majority might openly cite the Bible as an authority when discussing public policy, the right's emerging Tweed caucus intellectualized the culture wars. They made essentially the same points that Nixon political strategists had made amongst themselves in memos and behind closed doors, only with one erudition and more for public consumption. Their general message was that some people are simply born bad, and there's just no helping them. Talk about root causes, social intervention, or curing or rehabilitating deviancy was a futile attempt to debate away evil. Rioters, drug pushers, drug addicts, career criminals, these people were beyond redemption. The only proper response to evil was force, and then only to keep the evil from harming the good. These ideas found a home in the Reagan administration, where many of the people who had been advancing them found high-ranking appointments. Nixon had figured out the war on drugs were the common element among all his culture war enemies. Excuse me. Reagan's people took the idea and ran with it. Carlton Turner's focus on pot was a way to rekindle the culture war. In a revealing early interview with Government Executive magazine, Turner lumped pot with rock music, open and abundant sex, and ripped jeans. Drug use, Turner warned, was a behavioral pattern that has sort of tagged along during the present young adults' generation involvement in anti-military, anti-nuclear power, anti-big business, anti-authority demonstrations. People engaged in this behavior, he explained, form a myriad of different racial, religious, or otherwise persuasions demanding rights or entitlements politically. while scoffing at civil responsibility. At a 1981 meeting with his staff, Turner laid out his office's mission. We have to create a generation of drug-free Americans to purge society. There would be little tolerance for dissent. Turner was especially determined to purge psychiatrics from federal drug agencies. They're trained to treat, he said, and treatment isn't what we do. Methadone was out, so Turner blocked advocates of the treatment who were still in the federal government from speaking out about it publicly. He took on the public health crowd at the National Institute on Drug Abuse, or NIDA, working to get rid of the agency of officials and researchers who advocated a treatment-oriented federal drug policy. In 1982, a Turner Alley at the agency sent a letter to libraries across the country urging them to pull and destroy 64 prior NIDA publications he'd found that included information that was inconsistent with a new narrative about drugs. In one particularly brilliant piece of propaganda, drug warriors argued that one of the symptoms of marijuana addiction was refusal to believe the hard medical evidence that marijuana is physically and psychologically harmful. Questioning the drug war was in and of itself a sign of addiction. Reagan himself delivered a stridently moral message better than anyone. In a 1982 speech to a convention of police chiefs in New Orleans, his first major crime speech after inauguration, Reagan claimed that a recent study had found that just 250 criminals were responsible for 500,000 crimes over the course of 11 years. That boiled down to a crime every 2 days. That may have been possible if all the criminals in the study were drug users and the research counted drug use as a crime. But the statistic was given in the context of the harm that criminals do to society. It doesn't appear that Reagan ever sourced the study, but the notion that a team of researchers just happened to find 250 criminals with that sort of dedication seems unlikely. In the same speech, Reagan called for expanding the list of crimes for which judges could deny bail, revoking Miranda and the exclusionary rule, a major new role for the military in fighting the drug war, an overhaul of the federal criminal code to include dozens of new laws, and in general a massive expansion of powers and the authority afforded to police and prosecutors. Without missing a beat, he then explained that America's crime problem was not only a moral problem, but a problem inextricably linked to the expansion of government. A tendency to downplay the permanent moral values has helped make crime the enormous problem that it is today. One that this administration has, as I've told you, made one of its top domestic priorities. But it has occurred to me that the root causes of our other major domestic problem, the growth of government and the decay of our economy, can be traced to many of these same sources of the crime problem. This is because the same utopian presumptions about human nature that hinder the swift administration of justice have also helped fuel the expansion of government. Conservatives had always held the somewhat contradictory position that government can't be trusted in any area of society except when it comes to the power to arrest, detain, imprison, and execute people. But Reagan didn't dance around the contradiction. He embraced it. He blamed crime on big government, and in the same breath demanded that the government be given significantly more power to fight it. In words dripping with rectitude, he appealed to morality and defined the greatest challenge of the era as the struggle between good and evil. For all our science and sophistication, for all our justified pride and intellectual accomplishment, we must never forget the jungle is always waiting to take us over. Reagan said, only our deep moral values and our strong social institutions can hold back that jungle and restrain the darker impulses of human nature. So basically, they started this war on drugs. They started criminalizing people who have addictions, and because of that, they started needing more police. They were needing more police to arrest, to investigate, to criminalize, to incarcerate all of these people with addictions, whether they were buying or selling or growing, whatever the case was. And then because they were having what they felt like was success, they were going after so many people that they needed more people so they can really get out there and really take care of the issue by not helping these people necessarily, but just getting them away from these drugs from a short period of time, removing the drugs from their reach for a short period of time, and then basically bumped up all of the police, all of the entities, FBI, all of the agencies that were supposed to be fighting this war on drugs, and then blame the fact that the government is so big, that the government's reach is so big that they had to hire all these people to coordinate this war, that they had to hire all these people to run the jails and incarcerate people, get people off the streets. They blamed all of the expansion of the government on these people with addictions and on this war on drugs, which is a war that they created themselves because they were all for treatment, and then they just decided that's not making us enough money. We're going to do it this way now. We're going to start bringing people into jail. We're going to start charging people. We're going to start criminalizing people, because that's where the money was. The money was not in treatment. The money was in jails and prisons and government. The very first change in public policy that Reagan pushed through the Congress was the 1981 Military Cooperation with Law Enforcement Act, as proposed amendment to the Posse Comitatus Act that would carve out much larger role for the military in the drug war. The White House was particularly eager to use military radar systems to actively search for drug smugglers. Since Nixon's anti-crime push in the early 1970s, the courts had interpreted the Posse Comitatus Act as to allow the military to provide indirect assistance to federal law enforcement. Generally, that meant allowing the Navy to tip off the Coast Guard when it spotted vessels that fit the profile of those used by drug smugglers. The amended law encouraged the Pentagon to go further and give local, state, and federal police access to military intelligence and research. It also encouraged the opening up of access to military bases and equipment, and explicitly authorized the military to train civilian police in the use of military equipment. The law essentially permitted the military to work with drug cops on all aspects of drug interdiction, short of making arrests and conducting searches. The next year, Reagan pushed for more. He wanted the I'm just going to keep saying PCA from here on out. The Posse Comitatus Act. I'm just going to say PCA. He wanted the PCA amended yet again, this time to allow soldiers to both arrest and conduct searches of U.S. citizens. He also made official his desire to repeal the exclusionary rule, which would essentially free police to violate the Fourth Amendment at will. Republican Senator Strom Thurmond of South Carolina introduced a bill to accomplish both of these goals. What's we good?
It's now saying it's connected to the Wi-Fi.
It's saying live and it's like going back and forth. The one person watching, if you're like actually watching and you can actually, oh no, they're gone. It keeps disappearing like the... What up, it's your girl. Alright, let's get back into it. Republican Senator Strom Thurmond of South Carolina introduced a bill to accomplish both of these goals, in addition to other items of the White House wish list, such as expanded wiretapping powers. Oh, I guess that was it. Just expanded wiretapping powers. Reagan also wanted to expand asset forfeiture power to make it even easier for the government to take property away from people who had never been charged with a crime. In 1978, a law had exempted real estate from the types of property that could be seized. Reagan wanted that distinction removed. He also wanted the standard of proof for confiscation lowered to a mere suspicion that the property had been used in a drug crime, and to permit the government to take property before even issuing an indictment. The aggressive legal minds at DOJ also invented a new type of forfeiture called substitute assets. This would allow prosecutors to estimate the amount of money a person had made in the drug trade, then confiscate a portion of his property equal in value to their estimate, even if they couldn't meet the already low standard for showing that the specific property they were eyeing was connected to any crime. Unfortunately for the Americans who would later be victimized by these new crime-fighting techniques, there were no Sam Ervins left in Congress to protect them. The Democrats were eager to eliminate the perception that they were softer on crime than the Republicans. Senator Joe Biden, for example, preempted the White House-sponsored bill with a bill of his own, which gave Reagan everything he wanted on asset forfeiture. On September 30th, 1982, the crime bill loaded up with most of the provisions Reagan wanted passed the Senate 95-1. 2 weeks later, Reagan gave another speech at the Department of Justice with new proposals, most of which he could enact without authorization from Congress. The speech began and ended with Reagan's now familiar invocations of good and evil, then made the connection between drug trafficking and the mob. He praised America's great crime fighters, politicians, and journalists who had the courage to take on the mafia over the years, including, notably, Eliot Ness, the federal agent who forced alcohol prohibition in the 1920s. He laid out an 8-point plan to fight drug trafficking and organized crime. One of the proposals was to set up anti-drug task forces all along the border. In fact, One of Reagan's first initiatives was to establish an initial task force in southern Florida. He asked Vice President George Bush to oversee it. The concept was almost identical to Nixon's Oakdale strike forces. The mission was to put money, drugs, and guns on the table to generate photo op busts to show that the government was hard at work fighting drug dealers. The task force didn't do much to stem the South Florida drug trade, but it was enormously successful at producing headlines. So Reagan created 12 new task force just like it. Like Nixon, Reagan planned to enlist governors and state legislators to pass laws that mirrored the laws and policies of the federal government. So he promised to create new commissions, training programs, and intelligence sharing infrastructure to merge federal, state, and local law enforcement into a single drug-fighting army. Finally, he explained that America's jails and prisons would soon need millions of dollars to prepare for the inevitable surge of new inmates that would follow. Since the raid that ended the life of Dirk Dickinson, marijuana had become a lucrative cash crop in Humboldt County. It wasn't just biker gangs and seasoned drug traffickers anymore. By the 1980s, some of the country's green and granola community were also getting rich. That attracted the attention of the pot warriors and hippie haters in the Reagan administration. And so drug-fighting helicopters would again take flight in Humboldt County. But not just one. This time, there would be dozens. The project was called the Campaign Against Marijuana Production, or CAMP. It was a joint operation dreamed up by Carlton Turner and California Attorney General John Vandekamp. The plan? Bring in the National Guard to search for, find, and eradicate the marijuana fields popping up all over Northern California. The program began in the summer of 1983 when the federal government sent U-2 spy planes to glide over the area in search of pot. That's worth repeating. The government sent U-2 spy planes to the state of California to search for marijuana. Then they sent the helicopters. In all, 13 California counties were invaded by the choppers, some of them blaring Wagner's Riot of the Valkyries as they dropped guardsmen and law enforcement officers armed with automatic weapons, sandviks, and machetes into the fields of California. William Ruzzamenti, the DEA official in charge of the operation, explained to reporter and drug law reformer Arnold Trebach in 1984 why the helicopters were important. The helicopters have provided us with a sense of superiority that has in fact established a paranoia in the growers' minds. When you come in with a helicopter, there's no way they're going to stop and fight. By and large, they're running for the hills. It's probably worth emphasizing again that Ruzzamenti wasn't talking here about the Viet Cong or the Sandinistas. He was talking about American citizens. In CAMP's first year, the program conducted 524 raids, arrested 128 people, and seized about 65,000 marijuana plants. Operating costs ran a little over $1.5 million. The next year, 24 more sheriffs signed up for the program for a total of 37. CAMP conducted 398 raids, seized nearly 160,000 plants, and made 218 arrests at a cost to taxpayers of $2.3 million. for marijuana. Weed. The area's larger growers had been put out of business, or probably more accurately, had set up shop somewhere else. So by the start of the second campaign in 1984, camp officials were already targeting increasingly smaller growers. By the end of the 1984 campaign, the helicopters had to fly at lower and lower altitudes to spot smaller batches of plants. The noise, wind, and vibration from the choppers could knock out windows, kick up dust clouds, and scare livestock. The officials running the operation made no bones about the paramilitary tactics they were using. They considered the areas they were raiding to be war zones. In the interest of officer safety, they gave themselves permission to search any structures relatively close to a marijuana supply without a warrant. Anyone coming near a raid operation was subject to detainment, usually at gunpoint. Describing the 1984 operation, the journalist Dan Baum writes, "For a solid month, the clatter of helicopters was never absent from Humboldt County. Camp roadblocks started hauling whole families out of cars and holding them at gunpoint while searching their vehicles without warrants. Camp troops went house to house, kicking in doors and ransacking homes, again, without warrants." In his book, The Great Drug War, Arnold Trebek writes that in 1983 and 1984, Ruzzamenti claimed that the entire town of Denny, California, was so hostile to the drug warriors that he'd need to virtually occupy the area with a small army. Denny residents Eric Massett and his wife Rebecca Sue told Trebek that when they were pulled out of their driveway during a camp raid in 1983, there were 6 men in camouflage pointing rifles at them. They fled into town, where camp officials then put up roadblocks to keep everyone in town while they conducted their eradication campaign. When camp left, a military convoy drove out of the small village, guns trained on the townspeople. The couple told Trebek that one of them was waving a .45 as the other officers chanted, "War on drugs, war on drugs." But camp was just the marijuana eradication program in California. The Reagan administration had begun similar federal-state programs all over the country. In 1984, the federal-state marijuana eradication efforts conducted 20,000 raids nationally, resulting in the destruction of 13 million plants, many of them wild, and around 5,000 arrests. The following year, newly appointed Attorney General Ed Meese put his own stamp on the program by ordering the largest armed law enforcement operation in American history. On the morning of August 5th, 1985, Meese flew to Harrison, Arkansas to kick off Operation Delta 9, code for the scientific name Delta 9 tetrahydrocannabinol, as the psychoactive chemical in marijuana more commonly known as THC. The plan was for Meese to take part in a raid of a pot grower in the Ozark National Forest. Excuse me. Unfortunately, the 54-year-old politician's plan to cast himself as a heroic drug cop fell short when bad weather got in the way. Heavy rain, fog, and flash flooding reduced Meese's role to photo ops of him observing hillside pot growth from a helicopter and, during a press conference, inspecting the catch that other agents had brought back. Operation Delta 9 sent 2,200 drug cops on simultaneous eradication raids in all 50 states over 2 days. It was mostly for show, of course. Even the most feverish of drug warriors had to know that at best the massive effort would register as little more than a blip in the market for pot. The court also did its part in the 1980s to dismantle civil liberties for the cause of saving the country from drugs. In 1983, the court heard oral arguments in Illinois versus Gates. At issue was whether information gleaned from an anonymous letter sent to police was enough to establish probable cause for a search. Under the existing law and exclusionary rule, the case should have been open and shut. Since a 1969 court decision, police had been under the existing law and the exclusionary rule, the case should have been open and shut. Since a 1969 court decision, police had to meet a two-pronged test to determine if information provided by an informant was reliable enough to establish probable cause for a search warrant. They first had to demonstrate to a judge that the informant was credible. Second, they also had to show that there was a factual basis for the informant's allegation. In Gates, the police had no way of knowing whether the informant was credible. They only had the letter that the informant had sent to the police department. The court's conservative wing initially saw the case as an opportunity to carve out a good faith exception to the exclusionary rule. The facts of Gates didn't allow for that, but the court did dismiss the two-pronged test for an easier-to-meet totality of the circumstances test. The next year, in U.S. versus Leon, the conservatives got their good faith exception. After Leon, if a police officer inadvertently violated a suspect's Fourth Amendment rights during a search, but was acting in good faith, the exclusionary rule no longer applied. Moreover, the court wouldn't second-guess the officer's intentions. A defendant would have to prove bad faith, generally an impossible task. The ruling was essentially an instruction manual for police to use to get around the Fourth Amendment. Subsequent rulings further narrowed the Fourth Amendment. In Massachusetts v. Shepard, the majority again declined to apply the exclusionary rule, this time after police knowingly provided a defective warrant to a magistrate. When the magistrate returned the warrant, the police didn't bother to read it before conducting the search to see if the mistake making the warrant defective had been removed. The court said it was fine. In Segura v. United States, the court ruled that police who broke into a residence without a warrant, then hung out inside for 19 hours until they were able to get one, didn't violate the defendant's Fourth Amendment rights because they didn't actually begin searching the place until they obtained the warrant. Imagine that. Imagine that just for a moment. The police show up, break into your home while they're waiting for a warrant to be able to go inside your home. Because that's not just it. It's not just about the fact that they're searching for something. It's the fact that they've entered your property. It's the fact that they've entered your home. So they have entered these people's home and waited for 19 hours, almost one full day, until they were legally granted this warrant to be able to search the property. So that means for 19 hours, any officer that was inside of that residence was trespassing, was unlawfully occupying space in somebody's home until they were legally granted the ability to search the home. and they found nothing wrong with that. The court ruled that that was acceptable. The court also declined to sanction the officers because the majority didn't believe the ruling would make illegal breaking and entering by police a regular problem. In Nix v. Williams, the court introduced the doctrine of inevitable discovery, which states that if the police find evidence during an illegal search that they would likely have found if they had conducted the search legally, the exclusionary rule doesn't apply. Prior to these rulings, as previously noted, there were still plenty of forced entry raids into private residences in the name of the drug war. There had already been a number of wrong door raids and a handful of resulting fatalities. But there were still some checks in place to prevent violent raids from becoming an everyday occurrence and to induce drug cops to work carefully and avoid shortcuts. The exclusionary rule was the biggest and most important of these checks. If police didn't follow the proper procedures before breaking into a house, they risked losing any evidence they might find and wasting the time and effort they'd spent conducting the investigation. It was a significant disincentive, and the court's 1983 and 1984 decisions cleaved much of it away. Because 1984 was an election year, it would need to have an omnibus crime bill of its own. Polls showed that crime was the most pressing domestic issue with the public, so everyone running for re-election needed something to tout about on the campaign trail. At this point, there wasn't any real debate about crime policy. It was really only about which party could come up with the most creative ways to empower cops and prosecutors, strip suspects of their rights, and show they were more committed to the battle than their opponents were. The most significant provision in the newest crime bill again dealt with asset forfeiture. The new proposal was to let law enforcement agencies involved with federal drug investigations to share in any asset forfeiture proceeds that the case might produce. Previously, it's getting windy. There we go. All right. Whew. Previously, forfeiture revenues went upward towards general operations. Under the new law, the Justice Department would set up a fund with the cash and auction proceeds from its investigations. After the lead federal agency took its cut, any state or local agencies that had helped out would also get a share. The measure was considered uncontroversial at the time, but it is difficult to overstate the effect it would have on drug policing over the next 30 years. With drug investigations now a potential source of revenue for police departments, everything would change. The law's impact was immediate. After it passed, for example, the camp raids and those like them in other parts of the country were no longer about putting on a good show and terrorizing the counterculture. Now the raids could generate revenue for all of the police agencies involved. The DEA's Rusumenti was rather frank about it in an interview with Ray Raphael in his 1985 book on the camp program, Cash Crop. The biggest focus of what we're doing is going to be on the land seizures, Rusumenti said. Anybody who is growing marijuana on their land, we're going to take their land. It's as simple as that. It's done civilly through the federal system. Basically, people have to prove that they weren't involved and didn't know about it. Just the act of having marijuana grown on your land is enough to tie it up. Then you have to turn around and prove you're innocent. It reverses the burden of proof. Some people in Northern California owned thousands of acres of land, much of it densely forested. Growers were also known to set up operations on someone else's land without the owner's permission. If the feds started a forfeiture process, the owner was then in the difficult position of having to prove his innocence. Even then, federal prosecutors could argue that he should have been more vigilant about policing his property for pot plants. So, to put that into perspective, these people had acres and acres and acres of land. Most of it is like forest, real dense trees. You can't really see into it. It'd be something almost like rock cut, where it's where the actual growth is, not where the parking lots or where the open areas and the buildings are, but the more forested part of rock cut. So to say that somebody went in there and hid some marijuana plants and they didn't know about it or whatever, and the DEA or the FBI or some local law enforcement agency comes in and finds these plants, to say that the rock cut belongs to the government, so it belongs to the state. I believe it's a state park. But if that were, I'm just saying the example is that would be like somebody's land in California. So whoever it was that would own that land, that's has growth like rock cut has, whoever owns that would then be susceptible to having their property seized, because somebody else had marijuana growing on it without their knowledge. And when people raise those concerns, saying, well, that it wasn't mine, I don't know whose it was, they put it on my land, they basically told them, well, you should have been better about searching your land, or you should have been more aware about what was going on in your land. So they fully expected these people to be hiking through the forest of acres and acres of land every day or every other day or however often, policing their own land to make sure that nobody was hiding anything in the trees and hiding anything in the forests and shrubs and bushes, which is insane, completely insane. Nobody has the time to do that, especially if they're either working or have actual fields that they work in. Nobody has the time to do that. So, that's how they were getting their money, is that they were confiscating people's land that belonged to them, that they owned, because they were finding marijuana plants on it. Would take their entire plot of land. Some landowners face the loss of hundreds of acres of property over a few dozen marijuana plants grown in the area the size of a backyard garden. Because it was much easier to win land through civil forfeiture than to win a conviction in criminal court, federal prosecutors often offered to drop the criminal charges if the landowners agreed to hand over their property to the federal government. So to add that, they had the ability to take these people's land, but they knew that in criminal court, because this whole ordeal about seizing their land, taking their land because supposedly a crime was committed on the land, and anything that the person owns that works in conjunction with this crime, so any the house, the land, any cars that they bought with money from allegedly selling the marijuana, or all of that stuff, they deemed that it was okay to confiscate, to seize all of that stuff. So they would find these marijuana plants, and they're saying it's about the size of a backyard garden. So these people would have hundreds and hundreds of acres of land, forests, trees, bushes, shrubs, that they aren't going to search, because what's the point? If the police would go through and search and find plants, even a few plants, they would try and prosecute them and end up saying, because they knew that they weren't going to be able to get a conviction because they couldn't prove that these plants belonged to the person who owned the land. So because they knew that they weren't going to be able to get a criminal conviction, they would basically give them a plea deal saying, we'll drop these charges if you go into the civil court where we're trying to seize your property and just hand it over. And, I'm going to read it. But I'm sure this is something that, a few people fell for, even if it was not their weed, even if they had no idea about it, that it was growing on their land. I'm sure to avoid prosecution or spending time in jail for something that they didn't do, these people had to give over, had to allow the government to take hundreds and hundreds of acres of their land. They probably, they either lived on it, or they probably had, like farms or things like that, and it was how they were making their own income, how they were surviving, and they had to allow the government to take it to avoid facing time in jail or likely prison. So that's, that just shows the government overreach in this war on crime, war on drugs, criminalizing drug use. And it's just ridiculous. It's ridiculous having to give up your land because they found some marijuana in the middle of a forest. It's crazy. Those sorts of offers expose just how fraudulent the government's justification for its terror tactics really were. Allegedly, these pot growers were the dregs of humanity, greedily poisoned America's children with their sinister harvest. They were dangerous enough that the government had to send virtual armies to occupy entire towns, buzz homes, and chase children with helicopters, set up roadblocks to search cars at gunpoint, and strip suspects and innocents alike of their Fourth Amendment rights. These growers were that dangerous. However, if they were willing to hand over their land, the government was more than happy to let them go free. Because of the new forfeiture law, police agencies now had a strong initiative to find a connection between valuable property and drug activity, even if there was none. Now they had an incentive to conduct drug busts inside homes, and when the suspect could just as easily and more safely have been apprehended outside the house. They now had a strong financial incentive to make drug policing a higher priority and to devote more personnel to drug investigations than to investigating other crimes. Closing a rape or murder case didn't come with a potential kickback to the police department. knocking off a mid or low-level drug dealer did. Most perversely of all, the promise of financial reward actually provided drug cops with an incentive to wait until drugs had already been sold to move in with searches and arrests. A suspect flush with pot or cocaine didn't offer as much forfeiture potential. If they waited to bust him until he'd sold most or all of his supply, the police department got to keep the cash. Subsequent media and academic investigations would bear this out, finding examples of police waiting to bust stash houses until most of their supply had been sold, or of being far more likely to pull over drug or suspected drug-running vehicles in the lanes leading out from metropolitan areas, where they were likely to be full of cash, than the lanes leading in, where they were likely to be filled with drugs. Over the next 20 years, many states would attempt to correct these incentive programs by requiring that any money earned from drug forfeitures be given to a general fund or to a schools fund instead of going back to the police. But under a provision in the federal law called equitable sharing, also known as adoption, all that a state or local agency looking at a potentially lucrative forfeiture case needed to do was call up the DEA to assist their investigation. Even cursory involvement for a federal agency made the investigation federal and subject to federal law. Whatever laws the state legislature tried to pass to curb abuses no longer applied. The federal government then took its cut and gave the rest of the proceeds, sometimes as much as 80%, back to the local law or local police agency. These forfeiture policies would soon help fund the explosion of SWAT teams across the country, forging yet another tie between the escalating drug war and hyper-militarized policing. It was an unusually cold February night in Los Angeles, and Daryl Gates was riding shotgun in his newest toy, a modified armored personal carrier. Gates had been asking the city for armored vehicles for years, and he had always been denied. Though Los Angeles officials had fully embraced the city's SWAT teams by the mid-1980s, they were still squeamish about letting city police use military equipment. But in preparing security for the 1984 Olympics, Gates was able to obtain a couple of old APCs from the Department of Energy. In a former life, they had been used to guard nuclear power plants. After the Olympics, Gates had the vehicles painted blue, emblazoned with the city seal, and, cleverly, identified on the outside with the words, "Rescue Vehicle." It worked. The police commission let him keep them. Of course, Gates had no intention of using APCs for rescue. He was growing frustrated with the problems his SWAT teams encountered when breaking into fortified crack houses. They had tried ripping doors off the hinges by attaching them to tow trucks. That took too long, giving suspects too much time to destroy evidence. They had tried blasting locks open with specialized explosives called shape chargers, but those could throw off shrapnel and debris, making them dangerous for the raiding cops. Then one of Gates' subordinates came to him with a new idea. They could attach a battering ram to the front of one of the armored personal carriers. So Gates had one of the vehicles outfitted with a battering ram and found some abandoned houses slated for demolition that the SWAT team could use for practice. On this particular night in February 1985, Gates planned to unveil the new weapon on a suspected crack house in a relatively nice Pacoima neighborhood. Gates even invited along a couple of photographers to document his latest innovation for the archives. After stopping a few blocks away to attach the ram, the APC and the SWAT team approached the targeted house, this time with no less than the city's police chief riding along. The SWAT team took position. The APC revved up some momentum, hopped the driveway, and punched a hole in the side of the house. It then moved in and out of the hole several times to widen it. Yes, the symbolism is inescapable. Once the hole was large enough, the vehicle pulled out and the SWAT team pounced in. Inside, they found 2 men and 3 children eating ice cream. No drugs, though police later claimed to have found traces of cocaine and items they said were drug paraphernalia. Meanwhile, the APC withdrew from the house. It hit a patch of ice. The driver lost control, which sent the driver, Gates, and the chief's new toy careening into the side of a Cadillac parked in the driveway. It was not our shining hour, Gates would later write. Gates insisted that they had the correct house. He writes in his autobiography that the drug dealer had nearly run out of crack and had gone to get more. But it sure didn't seem like a crack house. Crack houses were usually filthy, heavily fortified, and furnished with the sorts of things necessary to make and sell crack. Nancy Reagan once famously visited an alleged crack house and remarked, "Where is the furniture?" Gates had raided a home. It had furniture, a fireplace, a den. More problematic for Gates, it also contained 2 women and 3 children, eating ice cream. The media and civil liberties advocates piled on. That only made Gates more defiant. He vowed to take his new battering ram to every single fortified rock house in this town. In his autobiography, Gates argues that the ram had a deterrent effect, that it frightened even the hardcore pushers to imagine that at any moment a device was going to put a big hole in their place of business, and in would march SWAT, scattering flashbangs and scaring the hell out of everyone. The ACLU took Gates to court over the ram. While LAPD officials insisted at the time that they weren't backing down, the department discontinued its use during litigation. By the time the California Supreme Court resolved the case in 1987, the ram had basically been retired, at least for the time being. The court found the ram to be so excessive as to violate the Fourth Amendment requirement that searches be reasonable, and it ruled that prior to each raid, the LAPD would need to get special permission from a judge before using a battering ram. In the same case, the court also ruled that city police did not need a judge's permission to use flashbang grenades. Gates' antics aside, the battering ram at least showed that as of 1985, we were still capable of finding that some drug war tactics went too far. It wasn't just the California Supreme Court. Public opinion polls also showed strong opposition to the ram. The ram was only used 4 times before community outrage compelled the department to stop. Gates had been forced to demilitarize his APCs by painting them blue and calling them rescue vehicles in order to get the city's permission to approve them. City officials were still wary about using battle gear on the streets of Los Angeles. A state Supreme Court was still capable of finding at least some militaristic police tactics unreasonable under the Fourth Amendment. We still had some limits. Unfortunately, that wouldn't last. At the national level, the once separate trends of militarization and the war on drugs continued to converge. On April 8th, 1986, the anniversary's coming up, President Reagan signed National Security Decision Directive 221, which designated illicit drugs a threat to U.S. national security. In addition to adding the drug interdiction responsibilities of agencies like the CIA and the State Department, the directive also instructed U.S. military to support counter-narcotics efforts more actively, including providing assistance to law enforcement agencies. In the planning and execution of large counter-narcotics operations, participating in coordinated interdiction programs, engaging in combined exercises with civilian law enforcement agencies, and training and helping foreign militaries conduct anti-drug operations. The declaration put pot, cocaine, and heroin at nearly the same class of enemy as any nation against whom the U.S. had fought a conventional war. There were a few other policies enacted towards the end of Reagan years that were little noticed at the time, but further cleared the way for mass militarization of civilian police agencies. One of the most destructive was a massive influx of federal money to local police departments solely for the purpose of drug policing. The money would be used to start, fund, and maintain SWAT teams, to expand narcotics units, or to pay cops overtime for doing extra drug investigations. Taken with the potential bounty available in asset forfeiture, police departments across the country were now heavily incentivized to devote more time, personnel, and aggression to drug policing and less to investigating murders, rapes, and robberies. There was no money in investigating crimes with actual victims. Drug investigations could pay for themselves, and often brought in additional revenue. Another new policy was buried in the National Defense Appropriation Act for fiscal year 1987. It instructed the National Guard to provide full cooperation with local and federal enforcement agencies in drug investigations. This gave the Guard its first budget for counter-drug operations. In 1989, Congress expanded the budget to $60 million. In some places, Guard troops were now even conducting searches and making arrests. But in the short term, the main effect of the new law was to give local law enforcement agencies access to National Guard aircraft. The other major new policy came in 1987 when Congress ordered the Secretary of Defense and the U.S. Attorney General to notify local law enforcement agencies each year about the availability of surplus military equipment they could obtain for their departments. The pre-election GOP crime bill of 1968 had already authorized the military to share equipment with local police agencies. But the 1987 law was more proactive. It established an office in the Pentagon specifically to facilitate transfers of war gear to civilian law enforcement. Congress even set up an 800 number that sheriffs and police chiefs could call to see what was available. And it ordered the General Services Administration to work with the Pentagon to produce a catalog from which police agencies could make their wish list. It had not been that long since Daryl Gates had been compelled to hide from his own police commission the fact that he had obtained a military-issue armored personnel carrier, or since he had to have his mayor call the U.S. Secretary of Defense to get permission to use a grenade launcher. Congress had now authorized, encouraged really, the transfer of vehicles, armor, and weapons, along with more mundane items like office furniture, that had been designed for use on a battlefield against enemy combatants to be used on American streets and American neighborhoods against American citizens. Not all police shared Daryl Gates' approach to the use of force. Norm Stamper still remembers the case that changed his mind about police militarization. Stamper joined the San Diego Police Department in 1966 as a beat cop. And for anybody that doesn't know, a beat cop is just a regular patrol officer, somebody who's just driving around in a squad car, pulling people over, getting calls, doing, working in a certain district, just, not like a detective or any kind of commander or anything like that, just a regular cop that works on the street. Some people don't know that. We're educating. We're in the business of educating. There's no stupid questions. By March 12th, 1987, he had worked his way through the ranks to the position of Field Operations Chief. That was the evening Tommy DuBose died. We were serving a series of high-risk warrants all over the city that day, Stamper says. They were going on all day. My guys who were serving the warrants weren't a SWAT team, but undercover field operations cops who had been working with narcotics. At around 6 or 7 in the evening, they hit a house in East San Diego. It was the home of DuBose, a 56-year-old civil servant who had worked for over 20 years in the U.S. Navy. Their warrant was for Tommy's son, Charles, who was wanted for drug distribution. Tommy DuBose knew his son had a drug problem. Consequently, he was an outspoken opponent of drug use and abuse. But he had nothing to do with that himself, Stamper says. Perhaps somewhat naively, I don't think he had any suspicion that his son was doing anything more than using. According to subsequent reports, the police knocked and announced themselves, then forced entry when an officer claimed to have seen DuBose run to the back of the house. Once they made their way inside, DuBose threw a glass of wine in the face of Officer Andy Rios. Police say the two men then engaged in a struggle over Rios' gun. Officer Carlos Garcia then opened fire, shooting DuBose 4 times in the back. DuBose died in his home. I wasn't personally involved, but these were my guys, Stamper says. They called me in. I showed up shortly afterward, and I saw this man lying dead in his own living room. He was just watching TV. He had no criminal record. All he knew was that some armed men were breaking into his house. The incident hit Stamper hard. Just overwhelmingly heart sickness. I mean, this man wasn't armed. He was not named in the warrant. He spoke out against drug use because he saw what it had done to his kid. And God knows how many other times we scared the bejesus out of innocent people. You hit the wrong house, or you hit the right house, but there are wives, girlfriends, kids inside completely unaware of what's going on. They could be completely ignorant of any drug-related criminal activity, but a girlfriend's home or apartment might have a stash that their male partner has secreted away, and so they get raided too. When one of these raids would just scare the hell out of women, children, family, pets, it just made me wonder what in the world we were doing and why the hell we were doing it. Tommy DuBose's wife, brother-in-law, and 25-year-old son Brett were all in the house at the time of the raid. None of them heard either the knock or the announcement. One neighbor who saw the entire raid estimated that only about 15 seconds expired from the time the police pulled up until he heard gunshots. Others said that they never heard any announcement. Brett DuBose said that he first saw the police pull up from the window in another room, but that they were in the house before he had time to say anything. And as I'm reading this situation, it's reminding me a lot of the Breonna Taylor situation, if you know what happened in Louisville, Kentucky. It was a similar thing, how they talked about a girlfriend's home or apartment might have a stash the male partner has secreted away, or, things like that. It was suspected that Breonna Taylor's ex was involved in drug usage or drug selling, criminal activity revolving drugs. And so they had got a warrant for him, and then they also got a warrant for Breonna Taylor's house under the assumption that she had something to do with it, or she had ties to him. Basically, they were looking for him, and she was known at one point to have ties with him. And so they approved a warrant for her house, but before they even went into her house, they had already went and picked him up. They had him in custody by the time that they broke into her house or apartment. And her neighbor said the same thing. Nobody heard anybody knock and announce themselves. And initially they were trying to say, yes, we did that. We knocked. We said it was the police. And then sometime a little bit after that, after the neighbor came out and said, no, that never happened, I just started hearing gunshots, and they went through the walls and stuff of the next door neighbor's apartment. So once that story came out, then it was, well, we had a no-knock search warrant. And a no-knock search warrant, also known as a raid, basically means that they can do sort of what they were explaining in the earlier, a few pages ago, where they were talking about like using a battering ram or just ripping off the door, or punching a hole in the side of the building and just everybody running in. So that's a no-knock warrant or a raid. You don't say, hey, it's the police, everybody put your hands up, blah blah blah, or you don't knock on the door and ask to search the place, serve somebody a warrant, whatever. You just knock the door down, you go in, you slap cuffs on everybody, and start searching everything, and then get whatever else figured out later. If you find something, then people get charged. If you don't find anything, which clearly happens because the police are fucking idiots, then they just kind of go, oopsie, we acted in good faith. We thought there was drugs, and so that's why we broke in. But in this case, as in Tommy DuBose, and in this case as in Breonna Taylor, in both cases, ended with somebody innocent getting shot. Somebody that didn't have anything to do with any criminal activity, who was unaware of any criminal activity, who wasn't engaged in any criminal activity or drug usage or drug selling or anything like that. People who weren't, had any hand in that were taken out. Basically, they were murdered. And this is, if I go back, this is, it looks like it's in 1987. And we had read a little bit about this in the book we read yesterday. What did we read yesterday? Yes, Locking Up Our Own. So, yesterday, I didn't read that part, but somebody had read a little bit about this story of Tommy DuBose. And, but yeah, that was in 87. And here we are, this 2020, last year, that this happened with Breonna Taylor. But from 1987 to 2020, what has changed? Because in the same way they broke into this person's home and ended up shooting an unarmed person, an unarmed man, they broke into Breonna Taylor's apartment and shot her. Both were no knock. They didn't, they claim, and they claim here in the book, and they claim that in Breonna Taylor's situation initially that they had knocked and announced themselves. But even in here, you hear the now field operations chief, Stamper, saying that all he knew was that some armed men were breaking into his house. So the same thing, Kenneth Walker, Breonna Taylor's boyfriend, Kenneth Walker, at the time, he had a gun when they broke in. He thought somebody was breaking into their house. So again, here we are in an extremely similar situation from 1987, and then Breonna Taylor in 2020. What has changed? What has changed in policing? What has changed in tactics? What has changed in their ability to make such a mistake that it ends up losing the life or taking the life of an innocent person? What has changed? What have we fixed about this system that made it so something like this can't happen again? And the answer is nothing. There's nothing. We didn't change anything. We didn't fix anything. We didn't make anything better. We didn't prevent anything, because it's still happening. The San Diego County District Attorney's Office eventually cleared the raiding officers of any wrongdoing, but the report did question their tactics. It found that the yellow jackets they wore during raids didn't make it clear enough to citizens that they were police. And in the DuBose raid specifically, the DA found that the officers didn't properly announce themselves and didn't wait long enough after the announcement before entering. The San Diego Police Department eventually acknowledged that DuBose was an innocent victim. Assistant Chief Bob Bergreen even acknowledged that the police had made some mistakes. The officers did not allow enough time or notice, he told the Los Angeles Times. They did not give the DuBose family enough time to answer the door adequately before they went into the house. The entry that quickly was not justified. But Bergreen added that because their mistakes were made in good faith, none of the officers would be disciplined, and the officers involved would continue to serve high-risk drug warrants. So it's kind of the same thing with the Breonna Taylor case. They said that they weren't doing anything wrong, even though they had already picked up the person, even though I'm sure they went back and they searched the house. You haven't heard any reports of them finding anything. So it was all for nothing. So they broke in this house all for nothing. They killed this person all for nothing. And, as many statements as I can say about one case, I feel like it definitely applies to the other. You can say about either Tommy DuBose or Breonna Taylor, they broke in, right? They broke in without announcing themselves. They shot somebody and killed them. They ended up not finding anything. It was all a pointless raid. They put other people in danger because it wasn't just Tommy in the house, right? It was his brother-in-law and his other son. So he put other people in danger that were inside the house, just as in the Breonna Taylor case, the neighbor and Kenneth Walker, who was there sleeping with her, were in danger. And the officers afterwards didn't have to face any accountability. They weren't charged, they weren't fired, they weren't They don't have to, they're not demoted. They're still out. They still got the same jobs. I think the one, I want to say Miles something, was like a sergeant. He's still a sergeant. The other people that were deputies are still deputies. The other people that were, whatever position they held and whatever team that they were a part of, if it was a SWAT team or if it was like we have here in Rockford, some sort of like scope team, or if they were working narcotics or, had some special assignment, whatever was their situation, they didn't get reassigned to anything. They felt, they faced no type of accountability. They weren't held responsible for anything that happened in either of these cases. They justified it. They said that it was completely fine that it happened. But clearly you have people behind the scenes that are willing to say, well, yes, it was wrong. They did wrong. They didn't wait long enough for the person to open the door. They shouldn't have shot through, in Breonna Taylor's case, they shouldn't have shot into the wall, or they shouldn't have just came in and started spraying bullets everywhere, or, this or that. But there was never any accountability for the officer who fired the bullets that took a person's life. There was never any accountability for the officers who broke into a home without announcing themselves, causing people to go into fight mode, right? Because it's fight, flight, or freeze is just a natural reaction. So broke into these people's homes, causing them to go into fight mode, and then ended up taking a life. There was never any accountability for this domino effect that they caused by breaking into the house or going in before giving the people adequate time to answer the door. Because had they given people adequate time to answer the door, who's to say that they wouldn't have just answered the door? You can't say, these people were innocent. Kenneth Walker has been cleared of all crimes. Breonna Taylor didn't do anything. Tommy didn't do anything. These people are not criminals. So to say, they wouldn't have answered the door, how do you know? So they didn't give them adequate time to even give them the benefit of the doubt. They didn't give them enough time to even attempt to open the door to them. And they just broke in, causing these people to feel the need to defend themselves. And then because these people were trying to defend themselves, they were killed in this process. The problem was that this wouldn't be the only mistake. On March 2nd, 1988, San Diego police conducted a 2:20 a.m. raid on the home of John Taylor, his brother George, and George's wife. 44-year-old George Taylor was thrown to the floor with a gun to his head. An officer then stepped on his neck to keep him in place while they searched the house. He had spinal surgery a year earlier. The police apologized when they realized they intended to raid the house next door. But a week later, the Taylors were again awoken by San Diego police. The cops were again raiding the house next door. This time, one officer mistakenly smashed out the windows to the Taylors' home, then pushed the barrel of his gun inside. 18 months after the DuBose raid, San Diego police stormed the home of Adelita Pena and her 3 daughters. They expected to find a major drug operation including kilos of marijuana, firearms, and ammunition. They found nothing. Lieutenant Dan Berglund, head of the city's narcotics team, refused to admit that they had made a mistake and retreated to the now familiar excuse that though Pena may have been innocent, someone else must have been selling drugs from inside her house. Of course, That excuse completely missed the point and showed how the drug war could blind police to the rights and well-being of the people they were supposed to be serving. Berglund's defense of the raid was that his officers had correctly raided the house where undercover cops had brought drugs from a man named Pete. That Pete didn't actually live at the house, or that 3 young girls, their aunt, and their uncle were subjected to a terrifying raid that turned up nothing, was all beside the point. And I have a bee on me, so I'm gonna take care of that real quick. Okay, hi. I hope it did not come back. Oh, no, I don't know where I'm at. Technically, Berglund's cops were probably right. That was all that mattered. Therefore, the raid was justified. 5 months later, another mistaken raid. Police say that they knocked on Ken Fortner's door, then decided to break it down when they heard noises inside indicating that someone was destroying evidence. But as Commander Larry Gore told the Los Angeles Times, during the pre-raid briefing, someone inadvertently wrote down the wrong number. Fortner was thrown face first in a flight of stairs. His friend, Kelly McAloon, was tossed onto a concrete patio and suffered injuries to his ribs that required a trip to the emergency room for x-rays. Like Berglund, Gore's justification once again glossed over the harm done. They went to this location with the best of intentions, he said. They were armed with all the correct information, and they had a legitimate reason to do what they did. They just had the wrong address. And your friendly local fun facts. There was actually over, I want to say, the end of last summer, there was actually a raid that happened here in Rockford, and they got the wrong house. So again, it's not, the stuff that we're reading about. I want to be very adamant that it's not just, stuff from the 80s. It's not just stuff that's happening out in California, San Diego, Los Angeles. It's not just stuff that's happening in the South. It's happening. It's happening here. It's happening locally, and it's happening currently. And this is not, like a new thing or an inconceivable thing. Right, this is something that happens to people that we know that are local, people that we know that are right here in our community. So this is something that happened to them, and it's something that they just kind of like, oopsie, we got the wrong house, and that was kind of that on that. Even though they terrorized this family was like deathly afraid. They made this family fear for their life for no other reason than they couldn't double check their work before they did it. So that's, it's not unheard of to happen around here present day. But unlike other parts of the country, things did improve for San Diego. In response to the mistaken raids and a number of questionable police shootings, Stamper spearheaded a series of reforms to move the department in a more community-oriented style of policing. By the early 1990s, San Diego police officials and the city leaders were in regular contact with civil rights and minority leaders. The city set up a hotline to report police abuse and persuaded a local TV station to host a telethon in which viewers could call to have on-air conversations with city leaders. In 1993, the Los Angeles Times credited those efforts with saving the city from the riots that hit Los Angeles after the verdict in the Rodney King beating case in 1992. City and police officials in San Diego were quick to denounce the acquittal of the LAPD officers who beat Rodney King, but more importantly, they had direct lines to the city's minority communities when the verdict was announced. They could build a strategy around empathy, not antagonism. Consequently, city officials knew that angry people would want to vent. So rather than suppress demonstrations, they allowed them. And in fact, they encouraged them. They then sent police officers into the city's minority neighborhoods. City officials later acknowledged that this was to prevent the protests from getting out of hand and turning violent. But because the city's embrace of true community policing, dispatching cops to their beats en masse look more like a show of support than a show of force. The cops knew the neighborhoods they were sent out to keep calm. Not just the street grids and landmarks, but the pastors, the school principals, and the community leaders. One activist told the Times, "One of the reasons we survived is that people from the mayor to the city council to the arts organizations got out into the streets immediately and sided with the people, not against them." While paramilitary police raids and botched raids continued to soar in large cities around the country throughout the 1990s and 2000s, in my own research, I found only one mistaken raid by San Diego police since the 1990 raid of the home of Ken Fortner. Interestingly, since the late 1980s, San Diego has also boasted one of the lowest crime rates in the city. It consistently ranks among the 5 safest big cities in America. Crime in the city has been falling for the last 2 decades. Crime in the city has been falling for the last 2 decades, just as it has in the rest of the country. San Diego's crime rate peaked in 1989. However, just as the new policies were taking hold in the city, the national crime rate peaked in 1991. As we'll see, there were a few other places that for at least a time bucked the trend toward more militarized police. As with San Diego in the 1990s and even Washington, D.C. in the early 1970s, not only were none of them overrun by drug dealers and gangs as a result, but there's good evidence that their lower crime rates outperformed comparable cities and the country at large. George H.W. Bush trounced through the Democratic candidate George H.W. Bush trounced through the Democratic candidate, Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis, in the 1988 presidential election, where he did it with a campaign that exploited the fear of crime like none since Nixon in 1968. The most notorious example was the racially loaded television commercial about Willie Horton, a black convict who raped and stabbed a white woman while on furlough from a Massachusetts prison. Bush and campaign manager Lee Atwater relentlessly attacked Dukakis as soft on crime, hitting him with Horton, his opposition to the death penalty, and his ties to the ACLU. 3 years later, Atwater, then fighting an inoperable brain tumor, would apologize to Dukakis. But Bush's victory was a green light for a whole new slate of tough-on-crime initiatives. One of his first moves was to appoint William Bennett to be his drug czar. Bennett had practically begged for the job, calling Bush and Bush's chief of staff, John Sununu, several times after the election to ask for the position. Bennett had headed up the National Endowment for the Humanities and then the Department of Education under Reagan. He had run both agencies as a proud moral scold, which isn't to say he was prude. Bennett was an obese man, a chain smoker, and the country would learn years later he had a pretty serious Jones for video poker. But those weren't culture war issues. Bennett was also a fierce drug warrior and a favorite of Christian coalition types. After leaving office, he'd basically appoint himself the country's guardian of virtue. Bennett's main contribution to the drug war was to infuse it with morality. The simple fact is that drug use is wrong, he wrote in a 1990 essay for Reader's Digest. And in the end, the moral argument is the most compelling argument. That was the lingering irony of Bennett's reign in the Office of National Drug Control Policy, or ONDCP. The man who often struggled to control his own indulgences was ready to unleash a full federal arsenal of force on people whose indulgences he personally found immoral. Of course, Bennett's indulgences were legal, but when pressed on the morality of the question, why is marijuana immoral, but alcohol and nicotine aren't, the best he and his surrogates could do was point out the fact that pot was illegal. When confronted with the legalization question, Bennett would return to the argument that pot was immoral. That sounds like a big circle. So pot is immoral because it's illegal, and pot is illegal because it's immoral. Okay. And then we got a low battery, so we gotta plug it in. It's on, you gotta turn it on, or just good. How do you know it's charging? We die. All right. Whew. The transparently circular bit of argumentation it's immoral because it's illegal, and it's illegal because it's immoral, would have been amusing if not for the fact that it had some very real consequences, up to and including ruining and ending lives. For all the war rhetoric to have come from politicians' mouths over the previous 20 years of drug prohibition, Bennett somehow managed to reach new heights of bellicosity. Embedded in his morality approach to drug prohibition, this was a new effort at dehumanizing drug users. Bennett demanded that drug warriors in the administration stop talking about addicts as sick and stop referring to addiction as a health problem. Going forward, going forward, the federal government would simply view them as bad people. Fundamentally, bad people aren't cured or mended. The only real question is how best to remove them from the good people. On his first day in office, Bennett took a page from Nixon and designed a plan for the nation's capital. He wanted a massive wave of arrests of drug offenders and proposed converting abandoned buildings into temporary prisons to house the arrestees until he could get more money to build more prisons. He didn't mince words about his intent. I'm not a person who says that the first purpose of punishment is rehabilitation. Oh man, I was talking to somebody on Facebook about this recently. About prisons. Remember that conversation about prisons and if they're for punishment or rehabilitation? Yeah. He's having that conversation. He said it. He said, I don't care. Prisons. Punishment. I don't care. Put the bad people. Take them away from the good people. It's for punishment, not rehabilitation. He said it. With his whole chest, this man said it. I'm not a person who says that the first purpose of punishment is rehabilitation. Purpose of punishment is punishment. Bennett said, the first purpose is moral, to exact a price for transgressing the rights of others. Punishment. It's a line Bennett and other drug warriors would use over and over again for the next decade. Of course, Bennett was advocating mass punishment for consensual crimes, which by definition don't violate the rights of others. But Bennett was never one for consistency, just force. Bennett and some other members of Congress briefly even considered declaring martial law in D.C. and bringing in the National Guard to enforce it. He did impose an 11 p.m. curfew, which was later overturned by a federal judge. In 1990, Bennett floated the idea of suspending habeas corpus for drug offenders. It's a funny war when the enemy is entitled to due process of law and a fair trial, he told Fortune. Lest that seemed too extreme, he hedged a bit. By the way, I'm in favor of due process, but that kind of slows things down. Later he told Larry King that he'd be up for headlining drug dealers. He conceded that doing so might be legally difficult, but said that morally I have no problem with it. Oh, it said he'd be up for beheading drug dealers. Oh, that's extreme. You're gonna behead them? He's down with prisons. Let's just cut their heads off. He wants to behead them. So we're past prison for rehabilitation versus punishment. Now we're just straight to, you know what? That's too much work. Just cut their heads off. That's wild. We were getting crazy. He said due process kind of slows things down. Why take a year? Damn. Why take a year or a year and a half to be going in and out of court proceedings when you could just cut their heads off? It could all be so easy. And morally, he has no problem with that. Bennett even urged children to turn in their friends who use drugs to police. Oh, snitch, don't snitch. Doing so, he said, was an act of true friendship. I can't. The country seemed to agree. Oh, what? One poll found that 83% of respondents would call the police on a drug-using relative. What? What? 83% of respondents would call the police on a drug-using relative. And that you should turn in your friends because it's an act of true friendship. There's a lot going on. There's a lot happening. Okay, all right. I'm like distracted. There's a lot going on. You had to be there. All right. Oh damn. Snitch on your friends, blah, 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 blah. Urging families to turn one another into the government for victimless crimes was once an idea we associated with Iron Curtain regimes, but the drug war encouraged it. Back in 1983, Daryl Gates had started the Drug Abuse Resistance Education, or DARE, program, which sent cops into Los Angeles schools to talk to students about drugs. The program swept the country, and by the mid-1990s, there were numerous reports of children who had turned in their parents for small amounts of drugs after attending the DARE lectures. Oh, what? DARE officials denied that the program encouraged such behavior, but in most cases, the children were commended by police and DARE for doing the right thing after watching their parents marched into squad cars and taken to jail for what were usually possession charges. Despite consistent data showing that drug use and addiction were abating, Bennett's drug strategy report of 1989 declared drugs to be a deepening crisis that presented the gravest threat to our national well-being. Bennett's appointment and subsequent hardline instigated a new round of drug war hysteria from other public officials. Senator Phil Gramm, Republican of Texas, and Republican Georgia Representative Newt Gingrich introduced a bill to convert unused Army centers into mass detention centers for drug offenders. Republican Representative Richard Ray of Georgia proposed that drug offenders be exiled to Midway and Wake Islands. With no distractions, Ray argued, it would be easier for them to rehabilitate. Ray's proposal even passed the House Armed Services Committee. He said that when he proposed the idea to a conference of sheriffs and police chiefs, he received a standing ovation. FBI Director William Sessions declared that the country would need to strike a new balance between order and individual liberties. Joint Chiefs of Staff Chairman Admiral William Crowe went further, stating that with the new anti-drug offensive, you're probably going to have to infringe on some human rights. In testimony before Congress, Daryl Gates proclaimed that casual drug use was treason, then recommended that users be taken out and shot. It was essentially odd comment, given that Gates' own son had a history of problems with drug abuse. On several occasions, in the 1980s, the House and Senate also flirted with extending the death penalty to convicted drug dealers. That's extreme. In terms of actual policy, Bush and Bennett proposed huge increases in funding to build new prisons. Their plan proposed 3 times more funding for law enforcement than treatment and shifted much of the enforcement emphasis from smugglers and dealers to casual users. The plan nudged states to raise penalties on users, to seize their cars, and to send them to military-like boot camps for rehabilitation, regardless of whether or not they were actually addicted. As part of the 1988 crime bill, Congress also created a new set of federal grants called burn grants through the Justice Department's Justice Assistant Program, through the Justice Department's Justice Assistance Grants, or JAG program. Over the next 25 years, burn grants would send billions of federal dollars to police departments across the country to fight crime in what amounted to a larger, better funded, more ingeniously planned, and thus more successful attempt at what Nixon tried to do with the LEAA. The Burn Grant program gave the White House another way to... The Burn Grant program gave the White House another way to impose its crime policy on local law enforcement. As local police departments were infused with federal cash, members of Congress got press release fodder for bringing federal money back to the police departments in their districts. No one gave much thought to the potential unintended consequences of such a program because there was no reason to. For everyone who mattered, the program was a winner. The program's losers would become apparent in the 1990s. The careless mixing of cops and soldiers continued too. In 1989, President Bush created yet more regional joint task forces to further coordinate between the military and law enforcement agencies across the country. But again, only for policing, or drug policing. One of the few voices of sanity in the Reagan years was Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger, who spoke out against his own boss's attempt to enlist the military in drug policing. Bush's Secretary of Defense, Dick Cheney, had no such reservations. He'd write into a DoD publication a few years later, "The detection and countering of the production, trafficking, and use of illegal drugs is a high priority national security mission at the Department of Defense." Democrats in Congress savaged Bennett and Bush's drug plan for not going far enough. Senate Judiciary Committee Chairman Joe Biden told the Associated Press that, quite frankly, the Bush-Bennett plan is not tough enough, bold enough, or imaginative enough to meet the crises at hand. Hey, fuck Biden, though. I said, fuck Biden, though. I didn't vote. Fuck that guy. We had no good options. Representative Larry Smith of Florida lamented the lack of more funding to hire more drug warriors. This is a war that is being brought without very many troops, he said. The most pointed criticism came from Representative Charlie Rangel of New York. A March 1989 profile of Rangel in Ebony magazine ran under the headline, "Charles Rangel, the frontline general in the war on drugs." Rangel told the magazine, "All these people are talking about protecting the world against communism and the Soviets. How dare they let this happen to our children and not scream with indignation?" It isn't clear just whom Rangel was criticizing. Just about everyone running for office had been screaming with indignation for 10 years. Yet Rangel called the federal drug war lackadaisical and indifferent, and said that it suffered from a lack of commitment. He damned methadone treatment as a crime and snapped that anyone who even mentioned legislation was committing moral suicide. By the late 1980s, the policies, rhetoric, and mindset of the Reagan-Bush all-out anti-drug blitzkrieg had fully set in at police departments across the country. Nearly every city with a population of 100,000 or more either had a SWAT team or was well on its way to getting one. The tactics that 10 years earlier had been reserved for the rare, violent hostage-taking or bank robbery were now employed daily by large police departments from coast to coast. I wonder where the United States is heading, Federal District Court Judge Richard Match, a Nixon appointee, told USA Today in 1989. My concern is that the real victim in the war on drugs might be the United States Constitution. Another federal judge, Reagan appointee John Conway, worried that police practices of this nature raise the grim specter of a totalitarian state. The free market economist Milton Friedman, who had worked in both the Nixon and Reagan administrations, was so concerned that he wrote an open letter to Bennett in the Wall Street Journal. This plea comes from the bottom of my heart. Every friend of freedom, and I know you are one, must be as revolted as I am by the prospect of turning the United States into an armed camp, by the vision of jails filled with casual drug users, and of an army of enforcers empowered to invade the liberty of citizens on slight evidence. A country in which shooting down unidentified planes on suspicion can be seriously considered as a drug war tactic and is not the kind of United States that either you or I want to hand on to future generations. The public appeared to side with Bennett. In the September 1989 poll conducted by the Washington Post and ABC News, 62% of the country said that they would be willing to give up a few of the freedoms we have in this country if it meant we could greatly reduce the amount of illegal drug use. Gross. Another 52% agreed that police should be allowed to search without a court order the houses of people suspected of selling drugs, even if the houses of people like you are sometimes searched by mistake. In Boston, police cracked down with Terry searches. The stop and frisk searches that were born of Terry v. Ohio, of any suspected drug offenders who cause fear in the community. A broad enough justification to let them search anyone at will. Suffolk Superior Court Judge Cortland Mathers described the new policy as, in effect, a proclamation of martial law in Roxbury for a narrow class of people, young blacks. A Boston Globe article in September 1989 described how what was essentially an occupation of neighborhoods was degrading an entire generation's opinion of police. One woman who worked with preteens in a city community center told the paper that the children have a negative sense of that the children have a negative sense of a police officer. They see the television version of a police officer who is knocking down doors for the bad guys. Then they see their friends, innocent people, getting stopped and searched. They see innocent people getting harmed by police for no reason. When I talk to 9 and 10-year-olds, they think all police are bad. A 13-year-old girl at the center told the Globe reporter, "Some officers let guns and badges go to their heads. They want respect, but they don't give respect. They don't get respect." Like when they jumped to the conclusion to shoot that 30-year-old man. She was referring to an incident in which a Boston police officer shot Rolando Carr during a stop and frisk. Carr was unarmed. An 8-year-old added, "Sometimes they should look more into the situation before they do anything." William Bennett supported what was going on in Boston and in a number of cities that had passed anti-loitering laws which had the same effect, to give police the power to essentially declare martial law in many neighborhoods. Such law enforcement saturations of mostly minority neighborhoods were merely due to the overriding spirit and energy of our frontline enforcement officers. Bennett said, "We should be extremely reluctant to restrict them within formal and arbitrary lines." Meanwhile, the pile of collateral damage was growing. In Riverside, California, police staged 14 simulations. In Riverside, California, the police staged 14 simultaneous raids over a 2.5-block area. The raid turned up very little contraband. In one of the raids, 50-year-old Richard Sears and his wife Sandra woke up to flashbang grenades and armed men in their bedroom. Unaware that they were police, Sears resisted and was repeatedly struck in the face with the butt of a rifle. When Sandra Sears attempted to escape the detonating grenades, she was pulled back into the room and thrown on the floor. Sears was arrested and charged with interfering with the police officer and resisting arrest. The charges were later dropped, and the sheriff's department admitted that the Sears had done nothing wrong. In March 1989, police in Gardena, California, raided the home of Lorraine Harris on suspicion of drug activity. By the occupant's account of the raid, Officer Davy Matheson mistook the sound of a flashbang grenade for hostile gunfire and shot Harris's 20-year-old son, Dexter Herbert, in the back, killing him. According to Matheson's account of the raid, another man, Mac Charles Moore, had run out of the bedroom holding a shotgun. Officer Matheson attempted to shoot Moore, but shot and killed Herbert instead. By both accounts, Herbert was unarmed. Prosecutors twice attempted to try Moore for Herbert's death. arguing that his wielding of the shotgun provoked Matheson to shoot Herbert. The first attempt ended in a mistrial. The second ended in an acquittal. Though law enforcement officials would often defend the paramilitary tactics as critical to preserving officer safety, cops were dying in these raids too. Boston detective Sherman Griffiths died after he was shot through the door while preparing to raid a suspected drug house. In May 1988, the Washington Post ran an article under the headline, "Show of Force." The piece profiled the new, particularly aggressive anti-drug police units at Prince George's County, Maryland Police Department. The article noted that the department was conducting more raids, more jump outs on suspected drug dealers, and making many, many more arrests than it had in the past. 3 months later, one of those teams conducted a drug raid on an apartment in the town of Riverdale. Sergeant Mark Kevin Murphy, 35 years old, crouched in front of the door in a position to position a hydraulic ram designed to blow the door open. As he did, someone inside opened the door. 2 of Murphy's colleagues responded by opening fire. One suspect was shot in the face. Murphy was struck in the back of the head. He later died at the hospital. The police first claimed that someone inside the house fired at them, but it was later revealed that the only gun in the house hadn't been fired that night. Murphy himself had shot an unarmed fleeing suspect during a drug raid in 1982. It's crazy. Officer Keith Newman, 24 years old, was also killed by a fellow police officer during a pre-dawn drug raid on August 4th, 1989, in Irvington, New York. The raid turned up 1/8 of an ounce of cocaine and no weapons. Newman had been married just 3 weeks before his death. And in February 1989, a black-clad police wearing face mask Support. In February 1989, black-clad police wearing face masks broke into the Titusville, Florida, home of 58-year-old Charles DeGristine, his wife, and their 4 children. They staged the no-knock raid after an informant told police someone was dealing drugs from the house and was protecting the drug supply with armed guards. DeGristine first heard an explosion, the flashbang grenade, then his wife scream. He ran to his bedroom to get his handgun. Officer Stephen House entered DeGristine's bedroom with his gun drawn. The 2 exchanged gunfire. House was struck and killed. The police found no large supply of drugs, only less than 1 gram of marijuana that belonged to DeGristine's 16-year-old son. DeGristine was arrested and initially charged with murder, which could have brought a death sentence. A grand jury lowered the charge to second-degree murder, which still could have sent him to prison for the rest of his life. The following August, a Titusville jury acquitted him on all charges. DeGristine later filed suit against the city. During discovery, his attorney found prior incidents of botched raids and excessive force, including one incident where, as police approached the house, the homeowner opened the door and invited them inside. They tossed a flashbang grenade through the door anyway. Titusville Dang, it just got dark. What? It just got dark super quick. It just like, it was weird. No, I lost my place. That was distracting. Titusville city manager Randy Reed called the lawsuit part of an overall plan of greed and publicity. 43-year-old Richard Elsas was sleeping in a trailer outside the Ripon, California truck stop where he worked when on the morning of October 20th, 1989, black-clad SWAT teams from San Joaquin and Stanislaus counties swarmed the building as part of a pre-dawn drug raid. According to police, they knocked and announced themselves several times, after which Elsas said, "Wait a minute." When he didn't answer the door, Sergeant Dayton Little of the San Joaquin County Sheriff's Department went around to the back and smashed a window with his flashlight. When Little looked inside, Elsas shot him, killing him. The other officers then opened fire into the trailer, killing Elsas. Friends and co-workers said Elsas was both a heavy sleeper and hard of hearing. They also told local media that he had mentioned having some safety concerns about some people and activity near the truck stop. The police found no drugs in Elsas's trailer, nor any evidence linking him to a drug crime. Officials from both police departments promised a full and impartial investigation. They never give. The police are never going to give you an impartial investigation. The police can't investigate the police. It's just quick math. But anyways, they promised a full and impartial investigation, even as they assured the public that their officers had followed all the proper procedures and done nothing wrong. Not surprisingly, the subsequent internal reviews at both departments cleared all of the rating. The police conducted a violent, volatile drug raid on the home of an innocent man, killed him, and got one of their own killed in the process. Yet, by their own measure, they followed all the proper procedures, and nothing about those procedures needed to be changed. The inescapable conclusion: raiding and killing innocent people is an acceptable outcome of drug policing. In 1994, a jury found the officers negligent and awarded Elsas's family $175,000 in damages. Not nearly enough and can never bring anyone back. Under the open fields doctrine, the Supreme Court had already given its approval to law enforcement officers trespassing on private property without a warrant to search for criminal activity, even when they had to scale fences, open gates, and ignore no trespassing signs to do so. The court then broadened the doctrine to include aerial inspections and photographs from fixed-wing aircraft from 1,000 feet or higher. In 1989, the court capped a rather ignoble decade of drug war decisions with a gobsmacker. The court gave its approval for police to hover in helicopters at low altitudes in order to see behind the walls of structures built on the private property of private citizens, all without a warrant. In 1988, a law enforcement officer in Florida got a tip that marijuana was being grown in a private greenhouse. When the investigating deputy was unable to see the greenhouse on foot, he used a police helicopter to fly over the property. After lowering the helicopter to just 400 feet from the ground, the deputy was able to peer into an open roof panel and spot some marijuana plants. In January 1989, by a 5-4 vote, The Supreme Court ruled that the deputy's actions did not constitute a search under the Fourth Amendment and therefore did not require a warrant. The plurality opinion focused mainly on Federal Aviation Administration, or FAA, regulations permitted a helicopter to fly that low. Justice Sandra Day O'Connor wrote a concurring opinion that the standard arguing that the standard shouldn't be FAA regulations, but whether it was common for aircraft to fly that low. If it was uncommon, then the defendant would have a reasonable expectation of privacy. But because the defendant didn't argue the point, O'Connor provided the deciding vote for the majority. Oh, what? Oh, she knew it was wrong, but because nobody in the case argued that point, she just let it go. That's like when you go into the fake court hearings, and anything that you don't write on that sheet of paper as a defense, you can't use when you go to do the hearing. That's what they did to them. Even though it was unconstitutional, they said you didn't argue that defense, so I gotta rule against you. What? Florida v. Radley was one of the last cases that William Brennan would hear. His dissent reads like a man with outrage fatigue. The plurality undertakes no inquiry into whether low-level helicopter surveillance by the police activities in an enclosed backyard is consent with the aims of free and open society. Brennan wrote, he then returned to a running theme in his dissents in such cases, that the court was creating a drug war exception to the Fourth Amendment. He noted that the plurality opinion suggested that the court might have viewed the case differently if the officer had seen intimate details from the helicopter, where in the Fourth Amendment is there a requirement that the activity observed must be intimate in order to be protected by the Constitution. Brennan wrote, if the Constitution does not protect Riley's marijuana garden against such surveillance, it is hard to see how it will prohibit the government from aerial spying on the activities of law-abiding citizen on her fully enclosed outdoor patio. Brennan then quoted from a Law Review article by Fourth Amendment scholar Anthony Amsterdam. The question is not whether you or I must draw the blinds before we commit a crime. It is whether you and I must discipline ourselves to draw the blinds every time we enter a room under pain of surveillance if we do not. Fittingly, Brennan closed with a passage from George Orwell's 1984. In the far distance, a helicopter skimmed down between the roofs, hovered for an instant like a bluebottle, and darted away again with a curving flight. It was the police patrol, snooping into people's windows. The court's last real civil libertarian retired a month later. The numbers. Number of drug raids conducted in 1987 by the San Diego Police Department, 457. Number of drug raids conducted by the Seattle Police Department in 1987, approximately 500. Value of assets in the Justice Department's forfeiture fund in 1985, $27 million. Value in the assets of the Justice Department's forfeiture fund by 1991. So from $27 million in 1985 to 1991 is $644 million. Percentage of U.S. cities with populations over 50,000 that had a SWAT team in 1982. 59%. So of all the cities in America that have populations over 50,000 people, 59% of those cities have SWAT teams. In 1989, 78% of those cities has SWAT teams. And in 1995, 89% of all of the U.S. cities with populations over 50,000 people had SWAT teams. Percentage of those SWAT teams that trained with active duty military personnel, 46%. Average annual number of times each of those SWAT teams was deployed in 1983. 13 times. So that's 13 times a year. All of these SWAT teams are deployed. In 1983. In 1986, the average for SWAT teams being deployed, the average number of times the SWAT teams were deployed, 27 times. And in 1995, it was 55 times. Annually, these SWAT teams are deployed about 55 times annually in the mid 90s, the mid 1990s. Percentage of those deployments in 1995 that were only to serve drug warrants, 75.9%. Percentage of cities with populations between 25,000 and 50,000. So this is before it was the U.S. cities that had populations of over 50,000. Now we're looking at cities that have populations between 25,000. So more than 25,000, but less than 50,000. That had SWAT teams in 1980 was 13.3%. In 1984, it was 25.6%. And in 1990, 52.1% of cities with populations between 25,000 and 50,000 had SWAT teams. Average annual number of times each SWAT team in a city with a population between 25,000 and 50,000 was deployed. In 1980, it was 3.7%. In 1985, it was 4.5%. In 1990, it was 10.3%. And in 1995, it was 12.5%. And 55 repeating. Some extra numbers tacking me in. Just little numbers. I can go for another half hour. I said I can go for another half hour. Do you want me? Would you prefer that you start at the beginning of the chapter? Or?
Whatever's easier for you. I'm going to keep reading because we're reading about the 90s and you wouldn't know anything about that. You're basically a 2000s kid. You said that's even more of a reason for you to read about the 90s because you don't know?
It's 1 hour of it.
Oh, what? He didn't see daylight until the turn of the century. He didn't go outside. He didn't experience life until All right, Chapter 7, the 1990s. It's all about the numbers. Why serve an arrest warrant to some crack dealer with a .38? With full armor, the right shit, and training, you can kick ass and have fun. That's from a U.S. military officer who conducted training seminars for civilian SWAT teams in the 1990s. Civilian SWAT teams. The 1990s kicked off with a familiar debate. Congress wanted the military to be more involved with the drug war. At the urging of drug czar William Bennett, the Bush administration was waging aggressive anti-drug campaigns in Latin America, the most notable of which was the 1989 invasion of Panama to capture military governor Manuel Noriega, who was wanted in the United States for drug trafficking. That action was made possible by an opinion from the Justice Department's Office of Legal Counsel, issued a month before the invasion. The opinion concluded that the Pos Comitatus Act, PCA, didn't apply outside of the U.S. borders. Members of Congress followed by calling for more police-like actions by U.S. troops to arrest suspected drug dealers in other countries. Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney had led the Republican push for the 1988 bill that included the death penalty for drug dealers and widespread use of the military for drug interdiction. One Cheney lieutenant, Assistant Secretary of Defense Stephen Duncan, said at a 1991 conference, "We look forward to the day when our Congress allows the Army to lend its full strength toward making America drug-free." Even some career military officials were starting to come around, mostly out of fear that after the fall of communism in Europe, the military would suffer a loss of stature if it didn't find a new enemy to engage. "The Soviet is being taken away from us," one D.C. military scholar explained to the Chicago Tribune. The Department of Defense had better develop some social utility arguments that match requirements of the American people. Even Cheney drew the lines at using active duty troops for civilian policing inside of U.S. borders, but that didn't seem to stop it from happening. The Christian Science Monitor reported in August 1990 that 58 active duty Army troops had assisted in Operation Clean Sweep, the latest marijuana eradication program in Northern California, and another 225 infantry soldiers and aviators in 9 UH-60 Black Hawk helicopters from Fort Lewis, Washington, helped find pot plants in Operation Ghost Dancer in Oregon. The early 1990s also saw a new push to find a greater drug war role for the National Guard. When you have the equipment and trained personnel, you might as well put them to work, said Representative Nick Marvulis, a Massachusetts Democrat serving on the House Armed Services Committee. When asked about the traditional line separating the military from domestic policing, Republican Representative Duncan Hunter of California snapped, "It depends on which is more sacred, that line or your child's lives." One influential Capitol Hill staffer gave an especially confused justification. "We have to take action of some kind, not because it's going to solve the problem, but because of the fact that the druggies have gotten their fingers into an awful lot of pies." Part of the reason why so many politicians were enthusiastic was that National Guard involvement brought increased funding to their states. In 1989, the first year of the program, Congress appropriated $40 million for the National Guard's drug interdiction efforts. The next year, funding jumped to $70 million. 2 years later, it was up to $237 million. Any congressman or senator who opposed Guard troops fighting the drug war out of principle risked leaving his state out of the bounty. In Washington state, for example, the state's National Guard received just under $1 million for anti-drug operations. The next year, the state's congressional delegation signed a letter requesting 7 times that amount. In 1989, in Portland, Oregon, Herb Robinson of the Seattle Times noted fully armed Guard troops had recently been stationed in front of suspected drug houses in a series of drug raids. In Kentucky, local residents became so enraged by frequent Guard sweeps in low-flying helicopters that they blew up a radio tower used by the Kentucky State Police. In Oklahoma, Guard troops dressed in battle garb rappelled down from helicopters and fanned out into rural areas in search of pot plants to uproot. National Guard units flew anti-drug surveillance helicopters and boarded up crack houses in Washington, D.C., flew surveillance helicopters and cruised the streets with infrared gear to spot drug houses in Brooklyn, sealed crack houses in Philadelphia, were sent to support drug raids in Baltimore, and helped serve 94 drug warrants during a massive citywide raid in Pittsburgh. Members of the Pennsylvania Guard insisted in raids of 2 factories that produced small glass vials. There were no drugs in the vials, but under state law, the vials were still illegal because they were primarily used by drug dealers to package crack cocaine. Oh, what? In the summer of 1990, an Army helicopter circled overhead in Massachusetts National Guard troops, some in uniform, some undercover, assisted police in Foxborough in identifying potential drug offenders at a Grateful Dead show. In rural Maine, the National Guard was assisting in Humboldt County style raids in rural parts of the state. Guard helicopters would perform flyovers, then raid teams consisting of federal and state officials would swoop in. The standard operating procedure is to come in with battering rams, weapons out and cocked, shouting profanities. A marijuana legalization activist in the town of Chesterville told the Associated Press in 1992. By the end of 1992, the National Guard's role in the drug war was fully operational. In that year alone, National Guard troops across the country assisted in nearly 20,000 arrests, searched 120,000 automobiles, entered 1,200 private buildings without a search warrant, and stepped onto private property to search for drugs, also without warrants, 6,500 times. Colonel Richard Browning III, head of the organization's drug interdiction effort, declared that year, "The rapid growth of the drug scourge has shown that military force must be used to change the attitudes and activities of Americans who are dealing and using drugs. The National Guard is America's legally feasible attitude change agent." I don't think that's what they're for. Symbolically, the National Guard bridges the gap between cop and soldier. Guard troops train like soldiers and dress like soldiers, and they are regularly called up to fight in wars overseas. But when they are acting under the authority of a state governor, Guard troops aren't subject to the restrictions of the PCA, giving the Guard a more prominent role in the drug war not only escalated the drug fight, it further conditioned the country to the idea of using forces that looked and acted quite a bit like soldiers for domestic law enforcement. He's still looking. He don't even know what he's looking for. What? Okay. All right. With more and more funds flowing toward drug eradication, police agencies began to step on each other's toes to grab grants and shares of the money earmarked for various anti-drug programs. That produced tragic outcomes for any citizens caught in the middle. In January 1990, for example, President Bush initiated a new plan to crack down on drug smugglers at the border. He designated 5 border regions as high-intensity drug trafficking areas, making each region eligible for a cut of the $10.6 billion he had requested to fund the plan. Okay, we're still live.
What up, what up?
Support. One of the regions included the San Diego area. About 3 years into the program, 41-year-old Fortune 500 executive Donald Carlson awoke around midnight to a pounding at his front door. He asked several times who was there. No one answered. Carlson became frightened. He walked back into his bedroom in the pitch dark to retrieve his gun, while nervously fumbling a cordless phone as he attempted to call the police. He then heard the glass window in his den shatter. That was followed by what he'd later describe as a thunderous explosion. Someone yelled, "He's got a gun!" Now terrified, Carlson fired at the door, hoping to scare the intruders away. Instead, they fired back. The first bullet flayed his upper thigh, severing his femoral artery. Carlson discarded the gun. He had just made it back to his bedroom when he dropped to the floor. He'd been hit by 2 more bullets. Carlson looked up and saw figures staring down at him, darkened behind the flashlights they were pointing in his face. One of them screamed at him, "Don't move, motherfucker, or I'll shoot." But the pain in Carlson's arm began to overcome his adrenaline, so he attempted to adjust it. Again, "Don't move, motherfucker, or I'll shoot." The men then rolled him over and handcuffed him. None of them attempted to give him medical attention. They left him to bleed in his own bedroom until paramedics arrived a half hour later. Carlson said that on the way to the hospital, he prayed for God to let him die. Fortunately, Carlson survived. What happened to him was a direct consequence of President Bush's new drug policy. The DEA and Customs had always had a bitter rivalry going back to the Nixon years. Bush's 1990 border plan had shifted a great deal of the federal government's anti-drug strategy toward the border, putting Customs in charge. That angered the careerists at the DEA and only intensified the rivalry between the two agencies. Because they were competing for the same pot of money, pressure mounted for agents to make big busts, skim over constitutional protections, and play fast and loose with procedure. The Carlson shooting is an example of how competition between federal law enforcement works to the detriment of the public, one federal agent later told the San Diego Union Tribune. A local judge agreed. There's no question that when you have turf wars between enforcement agencies, you're going to have a potential for disaster. The Carlson raid was part of an Operation Alliance, which itself was part of an border interdiction effort in which Customs and the DEA were supposed to have been working together. Subsequent reports would show that the project only inflamed tensions. Customs officials were so eager to make a big bust that they neglected to investigate the informant whose tip was their sole source of information for the raid. If they had done so, they'd discover he had a history of lying. According to the Union Tribune, the DEA had been paying him $2,000 a month to work as an informant, but had dropped him 2 weeks prior to the Carlson raid because he was unreliable. According to one agent, when a DEA agent says, "This guy is no good," the first thing Customs wants to do is prove the DEA wrong. Odder still, because the two agencies were supposed to be working together, there were actually DEA agents who participated in the Carlson raid, which was based on a tip from the informant the DEA had just let go for being untrustworthy. The police found no drugs or any evidence of any criminal activity in Carlson's home. They had also raided another home on the same night based on information from the same informant. That raid didn't turn up any contraband either. Nevertheless, Carlson spent the first several days of his convalescence shackled to his bed with an armed guard outside his room. By the time he testified before Congress the following June, he had been cleared of any wrongdoing. But the government still refused to give him the names of the agents who raided his home and who worked on the investigation. No one from the government had contacted him about taking care of his medical bills, which by then had topped $350,000, or covering the cost of repairing his home. No one had even bothered to apologize, and no agents had been disciplined or reprimanded, much less criminally charged. Only the informant had been charged, and those charges were later dismissed. Carlson and his attorney were told that neither Customs nor the DEA nor any of the local police agencies involved in the raid saw any reason to change their procedures as a result of what happened. In its report on the bureaucratic bumbling that led to the Carlson raid, the Union Tribune found evidence of other mistaken raids brought by the same misplaced incentives. Mid-level managers and federal law enforcement agencies face constant pressure to keep their statistics. Impressive seizures allow those managers of the drug wars to ask for and receive larger staffs and higher pay. So as long as performance was measured with raw seizure and arrest figures, drug agents told the paper mistaken raids would remain a fact of life in drug work. Added a San Diego-era narcotics cop, every narc, at one time or another, has hit a wrong door. In December 1994, Carlson accepted a $2.75 million settlement from the federal government. He never got an apology. Proponents of no-knock raids and forced entry raids had always argued that scrutiny from judges and prosecutors would keep abuses and excesses in check. Yet the police officers interviewed for this book unanimously told me that the beginning and about the mid-1980s, judges almost never denied the request for a search warrant. Some judges asked questions now and then, but even they rarely denied a warrant. As the sheer volume of drug cases picked up in the late 1980s and into the 1990s, many judges stopped asking questions too. A few officers said that they had known that some judges looked more closely at affidavits for no-knock warrants, but added that knock-and-announce requests were never a problem, even when everyone knew the warrant would be served in a dynamic entry. In 1992, University of Minnesota law professor Myron Orfield sent a questionnaire to Chicago judges, prosecutors, and defense attorneys to determine the state of the Fourth Amendment in that city. Even cynics would find the results dispiriting. More than 1/5 of the Chicago judges believe that police lie in court more than half the time when questioned about searches and seizures. 92% of judges said that police lie at least some of the time, and 38% of judges said that they believed that police superiors encourage subordinates to lie in court. More than 50% of respondents believed that at least half the time the prosecutor knows or has reason to know that the police fabricate evidence. Another 93% of respondents, including 89% of prosecutors, reported that prosecutors have knowledge of perjury at least some of the time. 61% of respondents, including half of the surveyed prosecutors, believe that prosecutors know or have reason to know that police fabricate evidence in case reports, and half of prosecutors believe the same to be true when it comes to warrants. Prosecutors also describe the unspoken understandings they often shared with cops, including prosecutors articulating cases to police in terms like, if this happens, we win. If that happens, we lose. Yet Chicago judges went on approving search warrants with little to no scrutiny. Orfield asked one more question. Did the exclusionary rule really deter police misconduct? Every judge, every defense attorney, and every prosecutor but one answered yes. Former narcotics cop Russ Jones says it wasn't always like that. When I first started writing search warrants, I had to take it to the DA, who would thoroughly review it. Then I'd take it to the judge, who would also give it a close look. Then the judge always read the warrant, always asked questions. By the time I left law enforcement, and certainly since, it had gotten to the point where the DEA no longer needed to have warrants reviewed by a federal prosecutor, and often the judge wouldn't even read it. It just became a rubber stamp process. And I understand this happening more and more. In many jurisdictions, search warrants can be approved by the magistrates who needn't even have any legal training. So basically, instead of certain jurisdictions taking their search warrants to go get signed by judges, they're signed by magistrates who don't need any legal training. So basically, somebody that they hire to just put their signature on something. A 1984 study of the warrant process in 7 U.S. cities by the National Center for State Courts found that magistrates spend an average of 2 minutes and 48 seconds reviewing warrant affidavits before, almost always, approving the warrant. They're just hired to sign warrants. They also found evidence that police magistrate shop. They seek out magistrates with a reputation for approving warrants quickly and with no hassles, and avoid those who ask questions. In one city, a single magistrate approved 54% of the search warrants over the period the study was conducted. The most popular magistrate in another city had rejected just one search warrant in 15 years on the bench. Not surprisingly, most police officers interviewed could not remember having a search warrant turned down. After the botched raid that ended the life of Ismail Mena in 1999, the Denver Post looked into how judges in the Mile High City handled requests for no-knock warrants. Again, the results were unsettling. Over a 12-month period, police in Denver requested 163 no-knock warrants. The city's judges granted 158 of them. Defense attorneys told the paper that they were surprised to learn that the judges had rejected even 5. Perhaps Denver police had come to the judges with more than adequate probable cause. Perhaps. But the paper also found that, astonishingly, many of the city's judges would sign off on no-knock warrants even though the police hadn't requested one. In fact, about 10% of the no-knock warrants were changed from the knock-and-announce warrants merely by the judge's signature. The police hadn't presented any additional information establishing exigent circumstances. The paper also found that in 8 of 10 raids over that period, police assertions and affidavits that they would find weapons during the search turned out to be wrong. In only 7 of the 163 no-knock affidavits did police present any evidence that the suspect had been seen with a gun. Of those 7 raids, just 2 turned up an actual weapon. The Denver Police Department requires that all no-knock raids be pre-approved by the DA's office. In about 1/3 of the raids, that never happened. And nearly all of the no-knock warrants were granted on little more than a police officer's assertion that a confidential informant had told him the suspect was armed or likely to dispose of drug evidence with no additional corroborating information. When confronted with the results of the investigation, the presiding judge over Denver's criminal court system wasn't particularly reassuring. "We are not fact gatherers," Judge Robert Patterson said. "It's pretty formulaic how it's done." On how a judge could possibly inadvertently approve a no-knock warrant when the police hadn't even asked for one, Patterson said, "If you sign your name 100 times, you can look away and sign in the wrong place. We read a lot of documents. We may, just like anyone else, sign something, and later realize that it's in the wrong place or the wrong thing. Is it wrong to not be paying attention? Fellas, is it wrong to not be paying attention? They said yes. No, it's just that we're doing things over and over again. Wrong. Hearing Patterson's explanation, you'd think he was talking about the elementary school teacher who might occasionally misgrade one of dozens of homework assignments. This was about giving armed law enforcement officers permission to break into homes in the middle of the night, detonate flashbang grenades, and point their guns at Denver citizens. Patterson, astonishingly, was calmly explaining how the city's judges couldn't even be bothered to pay attention to where they signed their names. Judges and prosecutors weren't just neglecting their responsibility to protect the Fourth Amendment. They were nearly conspiring against it. The early 1990s weren't kind to the father of SWAT. In response to the Rodney King beating of May 1991, Los Angeles Mayor Tom Radley asked Warren Christopher to chair a commission looking into the LAPD's use of excessive force. The commission's report was damning. It found a small but significant group of police officers within the department regularly used excessive force, and that LAPD's leadership did little to stop them. Between 1986 and 1990, the city had faced 83 lawsuits that resulted in settlements of awards over $15,000. The commission found that even though an officer's misconduct in those cases had often been egregious, it usually resulted in light and often non-existent discipline. The commission reviewed radio transmissions of LAPD officers referring to a drug roundup in black neighborhood as monkey slapping time, or fantasizing about driving down one particular street with a flamethrower. We could have a barbecue. The comments themselves would have been bad enough. Even worse was the fact that a culture existed within the department in which officers felt free to make them over police radio. The LAPD's focus on reacting to crime instead of preventing it, the commission found, had isolated officers from communities they patrolled. Cops were rewarded for putting up impressive arrest statistics and for being hard-nosed. The report found that drug and gang sweeps of the late 1980s had alienated LAPD cops from the community, creating reciprocal hostility and resentment. The LAPD did a poor job of screening applicants for violent backgrounds, and the department's training put far too much emphasis on force and too little on communication and problem solving. The communication found that when academy students went out in the field, they were quickly schooled to view the world from a we-they perspective. It also found that many of the field training officers who gave new cops their first experiences on the streets themselves had histories of misconduct or excessive use of force. The commission's finding on how the LAPD handled citizen complaints was perhaps the most disturbing and enlightening part of the Christopher Report. Of the 2,152 complaints filed against LAPD cops between 1986 and 1990, just 42 had been found credible by the department. Most were handled by the accused officer's supervisors, not by internal affairs. Intake officers actively discouraged citizens who tried to file complaints, often with verbal harassment or by making them wait long periods of time. Investigating officers made no attempt to find independent witnesses, meaning that the investigations often came down to the officer's word against the complainants. After shootings, officers were usually granted an unrecorded pre-interview before they were questioned on tape. The officers involved were also usually interviewed as a group, not individually, all of which gave them opportunity to work out any inconsistencies or contradictions in the story. Perhaps most tellingly, the commission found that when officers were disciplined, the punishment given to the officers who had embarrassed the department, drug use, corruption, theft, was much more severe than a punishment given to officers who had used excessive force or violated a citizen's constitutional rights, again reflecting a culture of us versus them. The Christopher Commission made a number of recommendations, but one made much more of a splash than the others. It recommended that Daryl Gates be removed as chief of police. Gates announced his intent to resign on July 13, 1991, 3 days after the Christopher report came out. But by the time the LA riots broke out the following April, Gates was still in office. Sparked by a jury's decision to acquit the LAPD officers who beat Rodney King, the riots themselves lasted 4 days, although there were flare-ups of violence in the days that followed. In all, 13,500 troops came from the California National Guard, the 3rd Battalion 1st Marine, and the 40th Infantry Division and 7th Infantry Division of the U.S. Army were sent in to stop the violence. There were 53 fatalities, over 2,000 injured, and property damage of more than $1 billion. The Watts riots in 1965 had made Daryl Gates a rising star within the LAPD. The helplessness that Gates and his officers felt while getting shot at by snipers in what had become an urban war zone had inspired him to create and push for the SWAT team, his most influential and lasting legacy. 27 years later, the riots after the Rodney King verdict effectively ended Gates' career. By then, SWAT teams across America numbered in thousands. Most of them weren't responding to riots or Black Panther barricades or shootings like the one on Surrey Street. Most SWAT teams were spending most of their time breaking down doors on drug raids. Though rioting gave birth to Gates' legacy in 1965, his proudest legacy was powerless to stop the rioting in 1992. Order wasn't restored until the National Guard showed up. One other big difference between Watts and the 1992 riots: far more Americans were beginning to see problems with police brutality. When Gallup asked, "Do you think there is police brutality in your area?" in 1967, just 6% said yes. In July 1991, it was 39%. On June 28, 1992, Gates resigned from the Los Angeles Police Department, this time for real. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to my co-star. Actually, I am going to hand it over, but we're going to end this live, and then we're going to start a new one. So, take a break, go to the bathroom. We're going to...
Not that quick.
Oh, no. Well, they could still go to the bathroom. You can't tell people not to go to the bathroom. All right. Bye.